Hello everyone, and welcome to the Redox Connection, where we dive in and talk about our extraordinary, beautiful bodies and learn how to take care of our own well-being. I'm Liana, I'm a holistic wellness coach, and I just love inspiring people to their full potential. With us today, once again, Dr. Ray Dixon from Thailand. Sawadee ka! Dr. Ray, and thank you for joining us. As you may know, Dr. Ray is a chiropractor, naturopath with 40 plus years of experience and one of the world's first redox educators. That's why we are so eager to dive into a topic about how of our beautiful bodies, the digestive system. And we want to ask Dr. Ray, what are we talking about when we refer to digestive system?
Okay, let me try and condense a very big topic as succinctly and short as possible. The bottom line to remember is food is not available. Most food is not available to the cells. Your body's made of cells, so you have up to 100 trillion cells, and they run on nutrition. Well, the nutrients, most, are not ready for cells. So how do we get them ready for cells? Well, they need to be catabolized. That means broken down, digested into cellular forms that the cells can make use of. And that predominantly takes place in the digestive system before those nutrients and macro food groups of carbohydrates, fats and proteins are absorbed. And then by the lymphatic system, or in many cases the blood, they will then be delivered through 100,000 kilometers of blood vessels to the 100 trillion cells of the human body. So that's how they get there. So you have a digestive system to make that food available to cells. You know, your carrot is not ready for the cell. So that's what your digestive system's for.
Wonderful. I just love the way you make it sound so easy and understandable for all of us. Now, the digestive system, what is it composed of? What are we talking about?
When I anatomy and physiology, I always used to say that the digestive system, and by the way, many will have heard of the gastrointestinal tract, the GI tract. This is your digestive system. So it begins at your mouth and it ends at your anus. So when I taught this, I used to actually teach the students, look, essentially the digestive system is outside of the body. Now, some people will be initially confused because you're going, no, it's in here. Well, yes, it is, but you're not in the body proper until you've entered the lymphatics, bloodstream, or the interstitial fluid around the cells. So it really is outside the body, even though it's running through the middle of the body. So, for example, your mouth, you're not in the blood or the lymphatics in the mouth until you cross through those mucous membranes. And a mucous membrane, like you see in the mouth, by the way, travels all the way through the gastrointestinal tract. Now, we can break down the gastrointestinal tract to sections. Now, remember, we do this for teaching purposes. God doesn't do this. We do this for teaching purposes. So your mouth, what takes place in your mouth with digestion? Well, you chew. That's why you have teeth. So that's called mastication. Be very careful with that word. It can easily be confused with another one, mastication. So you're chewing, it's called mechanical digestion. So you're chewing and breaking down food into that. It's called a bolus. So by the time you swallow, that's called a bolus from when you took that bite from the apple or the carrot. So that's mechanical digestion. But even in the mouth, you have saliva. Now, saliva is coming from glands, salivary glands, and salivary glands contain some enzymes. So that's chemical digestion. So you've got mechanical digestion, you've got chemical digestion. Both are important, which is why we should chew our food properly, to make it easier on the enzymes. Now, those enzymes, I'm not going to start naming all the enzymes of the GI tract because I would be teaching you the digestive system, and you'd need to do a course with me for the next months, let's put it that way. So we're just going to keep it simple. So there's one main enzyme in saliva. There is a secondary one, but the main enzyme is salivary amylase. And then, of course, you swallow. That's called deglutition. So when you swallow, the food will then move down the esophagus, the food pipe here. Now is when peristalsis begins. Now, peristalsis is part of mechanical digestion. Peristalsis is essentially muscles contracting this way and this way to move the food through the GI tract. That's what peristalsis is, but it is part of mechanical digestion. But then your bolus that you got from the food, from the mastication, will pass through the esophagus, and it will go through a sphincter into the stomach.
Yeah.
And it will enter the stomach. Now, the stomach, very interesting organ. There's more enzymes here to help with further digestion. In fact, your first protein digesting enzyme is coming from the stomach. And very importantly, though, the stomach mixes and churns your food, which is mechanical digestion again. So it does a lot of mixing and churning. The analogy I used to give people was like a cement mixer.
Yeah.
You know, mixing and churning the food, and it turns what was the bolus into what's called chyme. C-H-Y-M-E, chyme. That's that liquid stuff that you've all thrown up from your stomach on occasions. That's called chyme. So there's a little bit more mechanical digestion, a lot in fact, and there is certainly a little bit more enzymatic digestion taking place in the stomach. Now, another quick point is all things of the stomach are often referred to as gastric. So if you hear about gastroesophageal reflux, well, you're refluxing up the esophagus from the stomach, gastric. If you hear of a gastric ulcer, it's a stomach ulcer. If you hear of gastritis, it's inflammation of the stomach.
Right.
Then the chyme gets squirted through another sphincter. So you've got a sphincter at the top of the stomach, cardiac sphincter. You've got a sphincter at the bottom of the stomach called the pyloric sphincter. And then that chyme gets squirted out after 3 or 4 hours of processing, teaspoons at a time, through that pyloric sphincter into the duodenum. Now, the duodenum is the next step. I should backtrack just a fraction. The stomach also secretes hydrochloric acid. Now, hydrochloric acid is very important. It activates the protein digesting enzyme of the stomach, but it also disinfects what you've eaten. It kills bugs, a lot of bugs, bacteria, etc. So it's very important. So the gastric phase of digestion is an acidic phase. Now, once that chyme is squirted out into the duodenum, which is the first part of the small intestine, the small intestine is about 3 meters long. If you stretched it out, it would be 3 meters. And the duodenum is the very beginning. Now, in that duodenum, the whole digestive phase changes. It moves from the gastric phase to the intestinal phase. And it's alkaline. So how do we get gastric acidic contents entering the duodenum? Alkaline. Well, that's because there's pancreatic juice coming from the pancreas, and that's rich in bicarbonate, which is alkaline. And there's bile coming from the gallbladder and the liver, which is alkaline. And they are emptying digestive contents, very important for digestion, into the duodenum. So now in the duodenum, you've got the alkalization takes place due to this bicarb coming from the bile, which is from the liver, gallbladder, and from the pancreatic juice, which is also rich in bicarb, as well as many enzymes. Many enzymes come from the pancreas. So now you've got a lot of enzymes coming in for chemical digestion, which is taking place in the small intestine. You've got bile. Now, bile does not contain enzymes, but it does emulsify fats. Now, the best way to image that is to think of a big balloon becoming lots of little balloons. Okay, that's emulsification. So the bile salts will break down these large lipids into these very smaller clusters, which then allow the lipase enzymes to break them down even further. So emulsification is very important in the digestion of lipids, and this is all taking place in the small intestine. Now, the small intestine is where 95% of everything is absorbed.
That was going to be my next question. Where does that food that then becomes nutrition is then absorbed into the body? And here's the answer.
It's in the small intestine.
Wow, okay.
And of course, there's a lot happening all along the way. And by the way, the small intestine also secretes bicarbonate. And the small intestinal wall has its own glands, and they also are adding some enzymes as well. So, you know, the greatest chemical and final digestion and absorption takes place in the small intestine. And then by the time you've traversed that entire 3 meters, most of that has taken place. And then it's still called chyme here, by the way. And then the chyme, still liquid, it enters the large intestine.
Right.
Through another sphincter, the ileocecal sphincter, or valve. And it enters the large intestine. Now, most people are more acquainted with the name of the large intestine being the bowel. Okay, so sometimes called the large bowel, but it's the bowel. That's where your feces are formed. Because remember, when you poop out the other end, it shouldn't be chyme anymore, because if it's liquid, we call that diarrhea. Okay, so it enters the large intestine in that liquid form. And then by the time the large intestine, the bowel is about 1.5 meters. Peristalsis is happening, by the way, all the way through the GI tract. So to move those contents through the small intestine, there's peristalsis, mechanical digestion. There's also segmentation in the small intestine, which kind of locks the chyme in an area and switches it around like this to maximize digestion and absorption. Now, by the time you're in the large intestine, there's not a lot of enzymatic digestion to take place anymore. There's mechanical, because you've got to move that through the bowel and out the anus. So most of your nutrients are already absorbed, but not all. I mean, your bacteria in the bowel can make vitamin K and, you know, some B12, and so there are some nutrients that can be made and absorbed from the bowel, but not most. Right. And so the peristalsis is continuing to move the contents through the large intestine. Now, by the time you're halfway through the large intestine, you're semi-solid in healthy functioning bowels. And then by the time you move across the transverse colon at the top here and to the left side, before you move down the descending colon, you're pretty much solidifying. And then by the time you get down into the sigmoid part of the bowel, which is lower left of your abdomen, it should be solid. The feces normally would be fully formed and solid. And they are constituted, by the way, by waste products. You know, there are certain bacteria, there's certain cellulose, you know, fibers that you've eaten in your foods that can't be broken down. And that's why fiber is good for the bowel, because it moves the bowel like a broom as it moves through, cleans the wall. If you get enough fiber, remember, you can be deficient in fiber, not be eating enough fruit, vegetables, and whole grains. So, and then eventually you have defecation and you will poop out the residue of the waste. So that's an overview.
Extraordinary. How long does this process take normally?
Normally, healthily.
Normally?
These phases, they're gastric phase, intestinal phase, and then you've got the bowel. I mean, really, most contents, once they hit the stomach, 3 to 4 hours, maybe 5. Depends on the constituents and how much you ate. So the more protein, it slows down digestion a little bit. And then by the time you traverse the small intestine, you know, this is going to take quite some hours of processing and digesting and absorption. And then, of course, your bowel is an interesting one. It's referred to as the transit time. to pass through the bowel. This is where people notice huge differences between, you know, their brothers and sisters and mums and dads and friends, you know, topic of conversation. But I'm sure you'll find people who are constipated are very frustrated. And people who have irritable bowel syndrome with diarrhea, they're very frustrated too. And you can imagine the transit time through the bowel will be very different in an inflammatory bowel disease sufferer with bad diarrhea and blood in the stools than it would be for a constipated sufferer who has diverticular disease, where things don't move very well through the bowel because they don't have enough fibre. So you can't calibrate how long to move through the bowel in a nutshell. I mean, it should be certainly no more than a day. But the reality is people can, you know, my worst patients in terms of bowel movements was having one every 2 weeks.
Whoa, right.
Most healthy people will certainly have bowel motions daily and sometimes 2 to 3 times a day. So that's your range. And that's my own personal practice life range. I had 2 people in 40 years who went to the toilet for a bowel movement once a fortnight.
Wow. Okay. Interesting. And as always, when we touch a topic, we can speak about it for hours. Yet, thank you for helping us understand just how important it is, because normally I think it takes a moment for us to really become aware that what we're actually eating has got a function. It's a part of the joy of food and drinking, what is actually going on. While we going off with our lives, there's a whole workshop going on. There's a factory working big time for us. Now, we will touch these topics later on as we go along. We want to put down exactly what was the digestive system to have a clearer idea how important it is. And then we will dive into understanding the first when there are dysfunctions, what goes wrong, what happens if it's not functioning at its best. So we will invite you to come and look at the further series that we will be discussing some dysfunctions. But before we close, what would your suggestion be or your tips be to keep a healthy and vital digestive system?
Well, we need to do what you just said and actually talk about the compartments. So perhaps the next call we could do the upper digestive system. So we'll talk about the mouth, esophagus stuff. And then I'll talk about what you need to do to answer that question so that you have the optimum digestion in that area. And then we'll need to talk separately about the small intestine and all the varying factors that affect bile, liver, pancreas, and the duodenum, small intestine, for digestive purposes. And then we can address those. And then perhaps the final great topic would be the bowel itself. You know, malfunctions of the bowel, inflammatory bowel disease, you know, constipation, all those things that affect a healthy bowel, to separate that, including the microbiome, by the way. So we can do them as separate entities. They would just take too long.
Absolutely.
In video.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ray, for this introduction, and we'll see you all on the next series as we go along on these topics of dysfunctions to the digestive system. And please tune in, share with people that are interested on this topic and that want to be well, and ask questions, leave comments, and just remember that healthy cells, healthy you, happy you. Thanks, Dr. Ray, and see you soon.
Bye-bye.